I have to go kind of quickly, so I'm giving myself a little bit of notes. Let's see, make sure I cover everything here. We'll be talking about a couple of different brains and the problem of accidental feminism. All right, so Alva, you did a great job already telling us about the problems of neuroscience. In particular, it's decapitations. So Elizabeth Wilson, who's one of the feminist theorists who's probably done the most to think about neurology and the neurological body in the feminist context, has called this the decapitation problem. So I'm going to be talking about feminism's issue with neuroscience, but we now have to switch our critique of decapitation to some other kind of critique, given the emergence of the biocultural brain, the embodied brain and the plastic brain. So my thinking right now in struggling to write the biocultural brain is to figure out what feminism's neurological body is. In other words, what the real or better feminist problematic is in relationship to neuroscience and material thinkings about mind and brain, given recent developments in cognitive science and philosophy of mind, and also in neuroscience. So I will point out that there's some accidental feminism going on in philosophy of mind and in neuroscience that's in no way directed by feminist critique or feminist thinking, but offers some materializations or some empirical affirmations of certain feminist insights. And given that, certain feminists, and I should say critical insights, because of those insights, some folks have celebrated a certain kind of postmodern brain, or the subjectivity that could come out of a conception of having a brain that's incredibly plastic and biocultural or open to the world. So those celebrations come out in affect theory and in certain writings of mathematicians / philosophers like Brian Rotman and so on. And whether or not that kind of celebration can be part of a sort of a feminist critique is one of my concerns. And then I turn to the problem of biovalue, or in other words, how a plastic brain opens it up to certain kinds of biopolitics. And I end by suggesting that feminism is currently reworking its problematics in relation to materialism, the brain, and this problem of the body. So it's a big project. Clearly I'm not really going to be able to fully do that in my limited time, but let me give it a shot. Maybe I can at least sketch it out a little bit. So I'm assuming you've seen the first page of my talk. Did I just give it to you? I really am missing the first page, Jesse, of my talk. You just printed it out for me. How could you do that? Oh, sorry. It's so beautiful. And I cited everybody here. Linda Smith, Alvin Noe, Jesse Prince, Joe Ledoux. That was really nice. So I'll do it without that. Did you find it? No, I'll do it without. Okay.
I'll reprint.
You'll reprint it? So now we can get to know each other a little bit better. It's like 175 degrees up here. Oh my God. That's a good idea. Thanks, Jesse, for printing that for me. And in the meantime, I do think that I wanted to keep talking about Alva, about your thoughts, because they're so relevant here. In a sense, your critique is sort of important material for feminist thinking about embodiment and knowledge. And so is Linda Smith's work, especially the work she did with Esther Thielen in developmental psychology. Both of these efforts, and Jesse's work on embodiment and on embodied moral reasoning, and Joe Ledoux's work on the emotional brain, all of these do something really interesting that's of great feminist significance, which is open up cognition to the world, make the brain biocultural. In other words, taken together, taken as a whole, a plastic brain that is that involves emotion and cognition, that is open and acting, a cognition that is dynamically in relation to the world, situates the brain and situates its product, cognition, in a similar way to feminist thinking about situated knowledges. So the feminist critique of classical cognition, aside from it being decapitated, is of course that it's individualist, intellectualist, hyper-rational, that it also refuses a relation to the world. So it can become biologically deterministic, for example, or refuse history, right? And the background of feminist thinking about the body is, of course, to consider the ways in which the body is historical. The materiality of the body is contingent or subject to social forces. That's really been the feminist problematic since de Beauvoir. Since Simone de Beauvoir declared that a woman is not born but made, right? We've been trying to figure out what that born aspect really means, right? And to what extent we can be made. So these efforts, this movement towards situated cognition makes possible, thank you, an analysis of how one is made and even how the brain is made, and thus how the material aspects of cognition, or even if mind is wholly material, can be subject to history and culture, and therefore is not, does not reflect a kind of static natural law. Okay, so, good. So, feminists have been a little bit slow to realize that neuroscience and philosophy of mind and cognitive science, which maybe now here I'm going to sort of messily lump together in my references, so forgive me. It has promoted, though, a new kind of thinking about the brain and cognition, right? So, so Emily Martin complains, for example, I wish she were here, that the brain is often given the job of grounding a view in intellectual, public, and scholarly debates of the biological fixity, universality, or inevitability of certain arrangements of human life. So neuroscience can sometimes seem like the new genetics, the genetics of the 21st century, right? And particularly in the Science Times, but also elsewhere, the brain, especially when linked to evolutionary psychology, is often pitted against intellectual and political commitments to human life as diverse and cultural and open to transformation, right? And in addition, as Alva mentioned, but in the feminist frame, as Elizabeth Wilson has described, the neurological body in classical cognition has been decapitated, so considered in isolation from everything below the head, save the central nervous system, and even that to quite a limited degree. So she says, contemporary neuropsychology, she's writing this in 1998, mind you, contemporary neuropsychology rescues only the central nervous system, and only that to a small degree from Cartesianism. The rest of the body is readily abandoned to brute, non-cognitive mechanization. So for these reasons, feminism has watched with some horror as neuroscience occupies the public and scholarly consciousness, not only in science, of course, but in the humanities. However, the astonishing success of neuroscience, it has to be acknowledged, has been accompanied by and probably facilitated by the availability of increasingly complex views of the brain as biocultural, or increasingly complex views of the relation between the body and nature, or the neurological body and nature, such as what we just heard. So, despite that neuroreductionism remains the hallmark of science, and that deterministic accounts are readily available everywhere, particularly in efforts to make neuroscience socially relevant to economics and political science and so on, its fundamental conception of the brain isn't fixed. And the open and dynamic nature of neurological processes can be found in a number of conceptions of brain properties. The most fundamental of these, of course, is plasticity. what I'm really suggesting here is that plasticity represents an opportunity and a demand for a new problematics in feminist thinking about the neurological body. In addition, embodied cognition theories, which I think depend to a good degree on the notion of the brain as plastic, that have taken hold in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, emphasize the brain's reliance on the whole body to do its work, and the brain's reliance on its environment. So you have all let the brain out of the vat, and even out of the laboratory, right? So in this context, brains can be seen as biocultural constructions. So my interest is to consider how, and indeed whether, the plastic, embodied, biocultural brain answers the kinds of feminist concerns registered in various critiques that I will be referring to throughout the talk, but I've sort of just indicated. Because, of course, feminist commitments to the body and to embodiment, maybe they, of course, in this audience, is misplaced. Let's try the sentence without the of course. Because feminist commitments to the body and embodiment are actually quite different than those in philosophy of mind, in philosophy in general, and then cognitive science. But they also are explicitly counter to the idea of the decapitated brain, the isolated, abstract, masculinist, intellectualist figure of reason that has characterized philosophy and traditional cognitive science. So key to feminist theorizing of the body has been the identification and correction of various bifurcated models of mind, body, nature, culture, reason, emotion, intellect, passion, not to mention man and woman, that such a decapitation enforces. So the move toward embodiment in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and forgive me for saying this, but we have to admit, despite the efforts of people like Linda Smith and feminist philosophers like Miriam Solomon, have really carried on without much reference to feminist considerations, are nonetheless being tapped as resources for feminist thinking, right? And even as a kind of epistemic materialization of feminist concerns. So is it a kind of accidental feminism that's happening? It's a question that's occupying me. In this recent volume just published last month called Neurofeminism, Anne Jacobson, for example, argues that in regard to the feminist insistence on the social character of knowledge, she says, quote, cognitive science is happy to help. So is this quite right? Might embodied mind theory, combined with a seriously plastic notion of the brain, be an instance of accidental feminism? So I'm not going to be able to answer that here, but I'm going to theorize it a little bit more for us. At first, I have to say, of course, that the biocultural brain, in other words, the embodied plastic situated brain, has hardly been fully realized in neuroscience, and I don't mean to suggest that it has. Right? So Alva is still a rebel to some degree. Right. So Rebecca Jordan Young's book, Brainstorm, gives us a really great account. It's this astonishing takedown of 40 years of brain organization theory research, which is essentially the neuroscience of sex difference. So in relation to gender and sex and sexuality, it turns out that the brain isn't all that plastic in neuroscience. She establishes this pretty convincingly. And I think, as I mentioned, a careful review of the Science Times, or even really a lazy read of it, or a careful look at Nature Reviews Neuroscience, maybe, can tell you that determinism still reigns in a lot of the scientific stories we hear. Even so, we can find in scientific biology and in these related knowledges numerous indications that the social world is formative for the biological, that organisms reflect the diversity of their environments, and that history and organic processes are co-constituted. So, as the implications of plasticity are appreciated, even the most neuro-foundationalist paradigms are being discouraged from extreme determinism and reductionism. So when the completion of the brain appears to be infinitely deferred, evolutionary accounts of the brain appear incomplete. by necessity. As the plastic brain is realized only in relation, both to its own workings but also to the surrounding environment, neuroreductionism loses a lot of its explanatory purchase. And the brain's time scale shifts as the present becomes less directed by the evolutionary past and more animated with its future potential. Its spatial boundaries expand, of course, as its workings reflect a more direct relation with the world. So, in this sense, culture is finding its way quite deeply into the molecular. In my treatment of this, in my larger project, I'm doing yet another history of plasticity, but this one is from feminist perspectives. But I just wanted to remind you about plasticity's origins. I don't mean its ancient origins. We'll just go simply back to Victorian science. So plasticity was quite popular in Victorian neuroscience and psychology, and someone recently reminded me phrenology too. Psychologist William James, in fact, was among its advocates. James dedicated a chapter of Principles of Psychology, which is published in 1890, to considering a psychological question. How do human beings form habits and tendencies? And he answered in physical terms, noting that all matter, whether iron or rubber or plastic or organic matter, changes structure in the face of what he called a modifying cause. So I'll cite him here. Plasticity, then, in the wide sense of the word, means a possession of a structure weak enough to yield an influence, but strong enough not to yield all at once. Each relatively stable phase of equilibrium in such a structure is marked by what we might call a new set of habits. Organic matter, especially nervous tissue, seems endowed with a very extraordinary degree of plasticity of this sort, so that we may, without hesitation, lay down as our first proposition the following, that the phenomena of habit in living beings are due to the plasticity of the organic materials of which their bodies are composed. Woo! Yeah. Isn't that sweet? I'm going to get back to this, though, maybe in a more critical way. But James argued that nerve pathways were strengthened by repeated use. He uses this hydraulic model that's really empirically limited, right? Like water passes through, and the more current that passes through is sort of less resistance, right? It's not such a good empirical model, and the neuron theory was established about 3 years before the publication. Established is the wrong word. Cahal declared the neuron theory in 1887. Principles of Psychology comes out in 1890. So he didn't really have the benefit of an established neuron theory to help him. So he conceptualized this hydraulically, but even so, he grasped a feature of plasticity that neuroscientists would later elaborate. So basically that changes in nerve pathways are linked to changes in behavior. Okay, so this is kind of proto-neuroscience. But right about that same time, as I mentioned, Raymond y Cajal was working in the lab in Spain and opened up the question of plasticity neurobiologically. So when he described the neuron's cellular structure in 1887, among the questions generated from the new findings were how connections are made across synapses, when we know what those are, and whether these connections are fixed or whether they can change. So Cajal's own theory involves cerebral gymnastics, right, which argued that the brain could increase neuronal connections with mental exercise. He formulated the hypothesis, as his historian, Javier de Felipe, puts it, to explain the great intellectual capacity of certain individuals and how an individual with a small brain could become a genius. Note that Cajal also described society's responsibility to improve the brain, to perfect it as quickly as possible. He argued in 1894, it is a cultural task of the society to shorten the time required by the brain cells to reach their perfection. At this time, the brain's plasticity was still seen as restricted by age, reaching almost complete annulment in adulthood. Right? So while the brain's development was considered finished in childhood for most of the 20th century, and I won't elaborate on the details of this. We've got some high points in 1936 and 1944, and then in the 1960s, where plasticity seems to be more seriously considered. For most of the 20th century, plasticity in the adult brain was had fallen out of favor, and Cahal had acknowledged some plasticity in relation to trauma in adult brains, but didn't really get much farther from that. Right? Essentially, there wasn't such a good explanation of synaptic connection until 1936. That theory took 3 or 4 decades to take hold. So we don't get a serious interest in plasticity in the adult brain until about the late 1960s, 1970s. Okay, but the current status of plasticity, as you know, is that it's an incredibly fashionable idea, right? So the brain's now considered widely malleable throughout the lifetime, and we know that the brains of kittens, especially blinded kittens, and mice are considered plastic from various degrees, but now also the brains of taxi drivers, London cab drivers, are seen as incredibly plastic, and stroke victims and piano players and amputees. All of these subjects have been studied with a focus on neuroplasticity. So while many aspects of gross anatomy appear to be relatively fixed, the thinking now is that experience can change the wiring of neuronal circuits as well as the strength of neuronal connections, and collections of pathways in specific areas which tasks and gray matter, especially in the case of taxi drivers, can increase in cortical thickness in certain areas based on learning and repetition. We'll talk about the taxi drivers later, but my feminist joke is that taxi drivers are not born but made. So in another shift, of course, in the past 2 decades, is that neuroscience has abandoned a strong reliance on genetics, just like everybody else, in favor of emphasizing epigenetics. I think I'll skip over the description of epigenetics because you know it. But add into this mix then is new thinking about cognition. Right? So embodied mind theory places mind firmly within the body, endorses feeling and cognition, and links perception and action. Some of it does. I'm linking lots of friends and foes here in my description, so forgive me. So in contrast to computational models, which theorized, to use feminist phrasing, cognition from nowhere, embodied mind models insist on the locatedness of cognition. Cognition has spatial and temporal specificity, and in the most comprehensive versions of this framework, the body's spatiality is not, to put it in Merleau-Ponty's terms, a spatiality of position, but rather a spatiality of situation. So the embodied idea of mind, claims Andy Clark, forces us to take seriously the issues of time, world, and body. Time pressures are one real-life factor, so computers can compute at any pace, but real brains need to do things under real-time conditions. As we know, the sensory motor system is also a major focus of embodied cognition. The senses being conduits between the inner and outer body, and between the brain, the molar body, and the physical universe. Brains are increasingly conceived in active rather than passive terms, and linked more intimately with, the senses are increasingly conceived in active rather than passive terms, and are linked more intimately with higher order processes of cognition and conceptualization. And also important to embodied cognition are feeling and emotion. So affect and emotion has been linked by various scholars and neuroscientists, including, of course, a couple of the people presenting today, as integral parts of perception, attention, memory, and other aspects of cognition. And finally, cognition is embodied as well as environmentally situated to the extent that it's action-oriented. I think we heard a good description of that, so I'll skip my summary there. These perspectives broaden the theory to include the environment with which the mind-body interacts, such as Andy Clark's notion of an extended cognitive economy, which consists of neural, bodily, and environmental contributions and operations to cognition. So according to Clark, the brain needs the world to cognate for at least 3 reasons. First, it relies on the outer world information holding and sorting, and other work that helps it deal with the limitations of memory and attention. And second, the brain utilizes what Clark calls cognitive technology, which is anything from languages to pencils to notebooks and computers, to such a degree that they become part of an extended cognitive process. And third, he argues that even offline cognition relies on the body and its environment. Hi, Leonard. Because the brain's very ability to cognate is developed in interaction with the world. We might gather from this view that the information flow between mind and world is so dense and continuous that the mind alone is not a meaningful unit of analysis. And then dynamic systems theory takes this argument even further, seeing not representations in the brain but constant reciprocal and productive flow between brain, body, and the surrounding world. So the theory argues that relations between an extended embodied mind and the world break down meaningful relations between them. And many of these ideas come together in the movement advocating situated cognition. So Miriam Solomon's description most aptly aligns this with feminist thinking. She describes situated cognition as the embeddedness of representations of the world, learning, memory, planning, action, and linguistic meaning in the body's environment, conceptual structures, tools, and social arrangements. So this is a really expansive definition which crosses a number of disciplines, and it's held together by a negative program of rejecting a certain view of cognition as intellectualist, isolated, abstract, universal, general, and symbolic. So even though scholars in economics, evolutionary psychology, and even in my field, sociology, have appropriated neuroscience to further pretty conservative ideas from feminist perspectives. In other words, ideas that embrace extreme reductionism and determinism. The love affair that the humanities is having with neuroscience takes advantage of an embodied and plastic and non-reductionist vision of the brain, either explicitly or implicitly. So, for example, scholars in literary studies, performance studies, and cultural studies are using neuroscientific findings about mirror neurons, I should say even mirror neurons, to support the rethinking of relationality in embodied terms. And affect theory, I don't mean it in the psychological sense, but in the cultural study sense, as affect understood as a preconscious capacity to affect and be affected, a contagious intercorporeal but strictly precognitive bodily experience, is particularly excited by notions of embodied cognition. Because affect theory focuses on embodied relationality outside of cognition and even social meaning, it's found considerable resonance with certain and selected neuroscientific work on mind, feeling, and relationality. Jill Ledoux work is constantly cited here, for example. So affect theory is neo-materialist. It assumes biology is non-determined, open-ended, and vital, and affect theorists selectively draw from neuroscientists whose work is most amenable to that kind of approach. But while it's critical and politically sensitive, affect theory's appropriation of these kinds of neuroscientifically based concepts have not gone without critical notice. There's some disagreement now about whether affect theory is able to appropriate neuroscientific concepts without its determinist and reductionist baggage. And all of this raises considerable issues for feminist theorizing. I think I'll have to talk a little bit about feminism, won't I? Okay, so we have to admit that feminist thinking about biology is haunted by a certain modernist, mechanistic view of matter, as well as our long-standing complaints about certain sins of science. So since the 1970s, we've been often critique of the sciences, and in various ways we've sided with culture over nature, nurture over nature, ethnography over empiricism, social context over biological fixity. We've argued for being made and not born. So the bulk of our intellectual resources, until very recently, have been sourced from varieties of social constructionism, beginning with de Beauvoir's articulations of sex and gender, the constructivism of Gail Rubin, and the post-constructivism of Judith Butler, feminist critiques of medicalization and concepts of disability. With a strong view of culture, we have been combating a modernist, mechanistic view of biological matter, which sees it as fixed, predictable, governed by natural laws, and producing effects that are the inevitable outcomes of such laws. We have positioned culture as diverse and dynamic and social, and we've given culture, rather than nature, the capacity to make and remake the world. So in second and third wave feminism, culture extends, in fact, so deeply into nature that it, rather than nature, is often ultimately seen as the animating force of life. However, recent feminist theorizing has challenged this tradition. And this view is upset if nature itself is dynamic, capable of change and transformation, if indeed nature is plastic and biocultural. So a new cadre, maybe a fourth wave of feminist materialists, including people like Elizabeth Wilson and Jane Bennett, and actually some veterans like Donna Haraway and Linda Berg, are arguing just this. So rather than being constructed, nature constructs itself. Allowing agentic power does not return us to determinism, because the critical point is that nature itself is undetermined. And once we have a dynamic notion of nature, we don't need representation to dynamize the world. It's already dynamized. So against a view of biology as a system of constraints, or a passive site of cultural inscription, biology becomes an event in which history materially unfolds, where nature transforms and proliferates itself through constant engagement with its environment. So, contrary to feminist thought that has long aimed to be free from biology, Elizabeth Gross argues that freedom can be seen in the capacity for action and transformation, or really the plasticity inherent in biology itself. And so, as Haraway has long advocated since the late 1980s, really, the distinction there between nature and culture collapses. So cultural relations, she says, do not occupy a separate sphere from living material relations. Life gives itself in culture. So this kind of materialism does not reject the idea of natural laws, but points to an older Nietzschean and Bergsonian tradition of seeing matter as both ordered and free, turbulent and capable of spontaneous generation. So Darwin's been getting a rereading in neo-materialism. So it's more Henri Bergson than Steven Pinker, but also feminist and critical. So so nature's conceived as thrown into flux but not randomness, characterized by stable patterns as well as by innovation and novelty. So such a view has enormous intellectual advantages and is compatible with feminist commitments to the diversity and transformability of human experience. So from this perspective, feminism can't position itself against the brain unless we intend to remain haunted by a modernist view of matter. But neither can we take up neuroscience uncritically, as have so many neurophiles of late. Present company excluded, of course. As feminists, we don't have the option of presuming that we can appropriate a non-determined brain, a biocultural brain from neuroscience, without addressing its underlying assumptions and contradictions. So one major problem for us is that plasticity in neuroscience does not extend to sex and gender. It's in the sphere of sex, gender, and sexuality that the neuroscientific brain is most determined, which Jordan Young has shown. She has argued that while the hardwired paradigm is now widely recognized as a poor metaphor for the brain, it stubbornly persists in research on sex differences. So she analyzed 40 years actually, of research on brain organization theory, which posits that prenatal exposure to hormones influences neural development in a bifurcated way, giving us male and female brains. This research has manifold problems that she outlines in her work, but one of them is that it presumes that these differences are fixed in utero. So on this view, we are born, not made, women and men, And more broadly, we're born with the brains we ultimately come to have. So a significant neurofeminist intervention could be to offer an imminent critique of neuroscience based on its own understandings of plasticity. Welcome. Still good seats left. Oh my gosh, everybody came.
Once we started talking about sex.
Oh, sex. Came just in time. We're talking about sex. So, among other interventions, what Jordan Young proposes is a positive program. It's kind of, as Spivak will call it, it's a kind of affirmative sabotage toward neuroscience that would better capture the plastic nature of the brain in relation to sex and gender. So such neuroscience would focus on the dynamism of development, understanding processes more than permanent states, development rather than essences, or in current fashionable parlance, becoming rather than being. In the end, she makes the case that the primary resource for creating more acceptable science is actually biology itself. Biology understood not as a fixed output of determined blueprint, or cognition not understood in an input-output model, but a malleable, dynamic, and interactive model. So let me suggest that the embodied plastic biocultural brain must start from this position rather than end here on feminist theorizing about the plasticity of neurobiological matter. Because the biocultural brain does not only solve problems, but it opens new ones. In other words, the feminist problematic cannot be simply to argue for the brain's plasticity in relation to sex and gender, but to consider how a biocultural brain challenges feminist agendas towards the relation between nature and culture. So in other words, we have to read Jordan Young's book and then we have to begin our work. It's not the answer, but the question. So the brain has been celebrated, this plastic brain, this biocultural brain has been celebrated in critical thinking around feminism, near feminism, in relation to and friendly with feminism, as queer, as deterritorialized, as postmodern. Let me give you some examples. Sean Watson has described plasticity as the idea that, quote, throughout the brain there is a fantastic multiplicity of spontaneously erupting experimental responses to outside conditions, drive requirements, and other stimuli. This means creative chaos in a politically fortunate sense. We are, neurologically speaking, infinite multiplicities. There is an imminent diversity and thus deviation and unintelligibility. And this doesn't mean the bad kind of Judith Butler unintelligibility, where we have uninhabitable bodies or unlivable bodies, but the good kind of unintelligibility, the Deleuzian unintelligibility, right? Where we have brains that aren't organs, if you get the Deleuzian joke. Brian Rotman, too, links plasticity to immanent difference. Politicizing the extended brain, Rotman argues that through the human-technology interface, quote, we are facilitating the emergence of a larger, collectivized, distributed, pluralized intelligence by allowing ourselves to become othered, more parallelist, more multi, less individualized, able to see, think, enjoy, feel, and do more than one thing at a time. The outcome of this for Rotman, too, is immanent difference. Singular truths and subjects, linear history, hegemonic ideas are dying, and newly emergent is, quote, the possibility of a new plurality of truths and futures. Beings with an awareness of our, their, multi-directional itinerary. There's a lot of resonance here to feminist thinking about situated knowledges, plurality of knowledges, perspectival epistemology. And Catherine Malveaux, too, sees the plastic possibilities of rebellion, of creativity, of non-determinism. She says, plasticity directly contradicts rigidity. It's its exact antonym. In ordinary speech, it designates suppleness, a faculty for adaptation, the ability to evolve. To talk about the plasticity of the brain means to see it in it not only the creator and receiver of form, but also an agency of disobedience to every constituted form, a refusal to submit to a model. So, so my thinking is this a kind of accidental feminism, or is this actually implicit feminism? Or another way to put it is, can feminists go there? Can we get excited by this idea of a free, undetermined, open-ended, constantly transforming biocultural brain? Well, it helps to think further about Malibu's work. Her take on plasticity recognizes its openness to political economy. I may be the only person talking about political economy here today, so maybe that's why I'm on the schedule. Aside from having co-organized this. Actually, I'm on the schedule because Lisa Blackman couldn't make it, but and this is hardly Lisa Blackman, but she would have done a little political economy too, I'm quite sure. So Malibu sees considerable intimacy between neoliberalism and neoliberalist capitalist modes of organization and neuroscientific models of the brain, of the plastic brain. She argues that many descriptions of plasticity are in fact unconscious justifications of a flexibility without limits. How could we not notice a similarity of functioning between this economic organization and neuronal organization? How can we not interrogate the parallelism between the transformation of the spirit of capitalism from the 1960s to the 1990s and the modification brought about in approximately the same period of our view of cerebral structures? So, thinking about neoliberalism as emphasizing the plastic, flexible, global, transnational worker, and so on. So like Watson and Rotman, Malibu sees promise in the ontology of the brain, but she wants to liberate the plastic brain from the pressures imposed by neuroscience and capitalism. She distinguishes plasticity as the brain's ontological condition from flexibility, which is its capture